Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for EarthSave Canada's virtual speakers series. I'm Jen from EarthSave Canada, and today we are so pleased to be joined by Dr. Margaret Robinson. Thank you for being here, Margaret. I'm going to introduce Margaret in just a moment, and she's going to be speaking about lab-grown Mooseburgers, a Linui view on food technology. And I'm very much looking forward to learning more about this. So Margaret will be speaking for approximately 45 minutes, and we will try to leave some time at the end to take any questions that you may have. We also have a giveaway for those who post a comment or question for Dr. Robinson on Facebook. Those who comment or post a question will be entered to win a $25 gift card from vegansupply.com. So without further ado, I will tell you a little bit about Margaret. Margaret Robinson is a Mi'kmaq scholar and a member of the Lennox Island First Nation. She's an assistant professor in the departments of English, sociology, and social anthropology at Dalhousie University, where she's also the coordinator of Indigenous Studies. Dr. Robinson is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender, and Identity. So thank you again, Margaret, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Jen. I'm just gonna share my screen here. And, all right. So I'll start by introducing myself in Mi'kmaq, and then I'll switch to English. Gwe, nin deliwizi Margaret Robinson, lewet eskigawagi Mi'kmaqi. Hi, my name is Margaret Robinson, and I'm from the territory of Mi'kmaqi, and the portion of that I grew up in is called Eskigawagi. I'm a member of Lennox Island First Nation in Mi'kmaqi. The Mi'kmaq tend to call themselves the Elmo, so I'll use both of those terms interchangeably. In this talk, I'll examine how technological developments in how we produce food, such as the creation of lab-grown meat, can be perceived from a Mi'kmaq or an Ulnowi worldview. There's a lot of diversity among the Mi'kmaq, as among any Indigenous peoples, and so my view isn't the only view that's possible. Other Ulnu might have different perspectives on the issue and see the subject differently, but I'll outline my views and how they developed so that we can use that as a basis for conversation. I'll be drawing on the concept of Masit Nogama, or all my relations, which is a cultural view of all other animals as relatives to human beings. I first encountered this view in my family growing up, and then again in ceremony led by Mi'kmaq elder Wanda Whitebird, who talks about the people who fly, the people who swim, the people who crawl. And then I encountered the idea again in many traditional Mi'kmaq stories, including those about moose and their relationship to us as the Mi'kmaq. I first started to think about the Mi'kmaq relationship to the moose in my academic work. This work by Mi'kmaq artist Jerry Evans captures, I think, the significance of that relationship of the Mi'kmaq to the moose. Our 8-pointed star there in the middle symbolizes interconnectedness. It also represents the sun. And here the moose circle in an unending cycle, perhaps of death and rebirth. So the Mi'kmaq, like many other Indigenous groups, also see animals and people as reincarnating throughout many lives. And the Mi'kmaq relationship with the moose has shifted over time, and today includes specific cultural protocols about how to treat moose throughout the year, when they can be hunted, when they can't, how they can be hunted, what needs to be done to show respect for the body and the spirit of the slain moose. And I'll describe how Ulnowi protocols of respect and gratitude toward moose might change with the introduction of lab-produced meat products. In doing this, I'll draw on how the Mi'kmaq relationship to the moose changes over time, and I'll touch on our growing knowledge of epigenetics. I describe my work as speculative philosophy because I start from the knowledge I have and imagine what those values and practices might mean in a different context. In an article for a Mi'kmaq perspective on cultured meat, we can infer from our philosophy and traditional stories and from protocols that we have in our culture that are already in place for plants and medicines. And so I'll be building from that accumulation of observations over time, and also of the benefit of prolonged reflection and engagement with those protocols, with cultural knowledge, and also with emerging science. I started analyzing traditional Mi'kmaq stories back in 2012 as a way to deepen my engagement with my Mi'kmaq culture while living in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. And so I wasn't in my traditional territory, and I hadn't been for a long time. I lived in Toronto for 20 years total, doing grad school and then work. And so I was starting to feel really disconnected. And what I did was tried to reconnect with my territory and our people by reconnecting with our traditional stories. And one of the stories I came across in that work was about a Mi'kmaq family who were starving during a harsh winter. Sometimes the winter is presented as having come upon them suddenly in the span of one evening. And so suddenly the people are trapped in deep snow without any way to feed themselves, and they're away from their traditional food sources along the coast. So this reflects, traditionally our people were migratory. They would move inland in the winter, and then they would move to the coast in the summer. And so the suggestion is the family are trapped inland without any food. And the story has a moose that approaches them and offers itself as food. And I was struck by this because at the time I was trying to figure out how my emerging vegan diet was going to interact with, or perhaps even undermine, my Indigenous identity. And so I did a lot of reflecting on this. And the work on that story was published in the Canadian Journal of Native Studies. You can see down at the bottom, I called it Veganism and Mi'kmaq Legends. I now sort of wish I hadn't used the word legends, because that sort of suggests that it's not true, whereas the stories are very much active and alive in the way that we use them currently. They're not just old stories, they're stories that we see as still happening today. So I'll give you a bit more background. I explored further, expanding on what I had done in the original piece, examining some Mi'kmaq stories. I examined additional stories to see if this still held true, if my beliefs, my theories still worked, and that went into an article for Societies. In that work, I examined traditional stories in relation to the Mi'kmaq cultural view of other animals as persons, and sometimes as siblings to human beings. And this was something that I found really interesting in Mi'kmaq stories as I started to read more and more of them, particularly ones that were about Glooskap, that framed Glooskap in particular as having a relationship of kinship and friendship to animals, and particularly to one animal, the American pine marten, Abistanoich. And I'll talk more about Abistanoich in a bit. And so this view of humans as related to other animals, the view of all animals as essentially individuals with their own personalities and their own intellects. This really stood out for me as something different to what a lot of my settler friends had grown up with. And I related this to the belief expressed by some Mi'kmaq that animals sacrifice themselves to feed human beings, that human and animal spirits are somehow eternal, and that spirits reincarnate. And I connected this to hunting practices and how they attempt to enact reciprocity in an animal-human relationship that is multi-generational and cyclical, but involves expressions of respect and honor. And I considered how I might engage with the Mi'kmaq value of avoiding scarcity, Nadukalimk, in ways that didn't require animal death. So I was trying to figure out how do I still be a Mi'kmaq person in the middle of downtown Toronto when I'm not hunting, I'm not gathering. In fact, the closest I get is when I would go into Kensington Market or Chinatown to purchase fresh food. What do I do in order to be more fully engaged with my nation? And can I do that through food? And so as a result of my article in Canadian Journal of Native Studies, I was invited to some animal studies conferences. And this really helped because it helped me engage with other Indigenous people, with other settler people working in critical animal studies. And it helped expand my understanding of what the field of critical animal studies was about. which in many ways had been new to me. So I got invited to some conferences. I was invited to contribute a reflection on in vitro meat to a book that was developing now called Critical Perspectives on Veganism. And this eventually became my article, Is the Moose Still My Brother If We Don't Eat Him? Edited by Jay Castricano and Rasmus R. Simonson. And so I agreed that the first challenge was that I didn't know anything about lab-grown meat, apart from what the editors of the book had told me about it. So I started researching. I knew our stories pretty well at that juncture. I had a strong sense of what kind of personhood framework I was using, but I didn't know enough of the science of lab-grown or cultured or cell or in vitro meat, as they were sometimes calling it, to really understand what it was that I was trying to connect with. So I started looking into what exactly is lab-grown meat? How does it work? And here's what I found. Back in 2012, vascular physiologist Dr. Mark Post and colleagues from Maastricht University grew thin strips of cow muscle in a nutrient-rich dish. And then they added lab-grown fat cells and they tinted the muscle. Post lab produced what the New York Times described as the $325,000 burger. And then one CNN reporter called it the future of food. And since then, over 60 companies have taken up the mission to grow meat in a lab. So this is something that already has hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in it. It's not going away. Basically, how it works is muscle cells are taken from a living animal, usually using a process known as biopsy, sort of a core sample of muscle. The stem cells from that core sample are fed nutrients and stimulated to grow using growth serum. Initially, this serum came from the blood of fetuses, not always of the same animal. So if you were looking to make chicken cells grow, for instance, it didn't necessarily mean that the growth serum you were using came from a chicken. And so, as you might imagine, for the opportunity to market your meat to people who are not themselves usually meat eaters, this was a bit squicky. And so requiring the death of the gestating animal in order to obtain the fetal cells, eventually companies figured out, how can we get this from a plant source? And so algae has been identified as a substitute and is now being used fairly frequently because it enables the company to describe their work in a way that isn't going to be off-putting for their potential audience. And so plant-based serums are now in use. The muscle cells grow on a supporting scaffold inside a machine called a bioreactor, where the muscle cells are exercised using electric impulses to grow the proteins. And then the final product, these grown proteins, this sort of muscle in the machine, is ground up along with fat cells and other flavorings and colors, and then used to produce food. So that's the basic premise of cultured meat. And this was what I was asking myself, how do I connect this to my culture? And how do I connect it to my culture's values, particularly values related to food? In December of 2020, The Guardian reported that a US company called Eat Just had received approval for its lab-grown chicken bites to be served in a Singapore restaurant. So cultured meat is being sold. Just this year, US President Joe Biden issued an executive order committing the US to invest in biotechnology, including cultured meat. In the UK, a company called Primeval Foods announced its intention to offer lion, tiger, and zebra meat grown in a lab to Michelin star restaurants in London. Promoters of cultured meat argue it's significantly better for the environment. In a recent article from 2021, Francesco Agena and Philip Howard report that compared to conventional meat production, cultured meat uses up to 45% less energy, emits 96% less greenhouse gas, and uses 99% less land, and up to 96% less water. So this is a significant promise. This could dramatically change the environments in which we live because a lot of resources are currently going to agricultural animal production. Josh Tetrick, co-founder and chief executive officer of Eat Just, said, My hope is that this leads to a world in the next handful of years where the majority of meat doesn't require killing a single animal or tearing down a single tree. And so that's a pretty radical vision, especially if you know anything about the history of meat and how it connects with colonialism and the need for new spaces to produce meat due to overpopulation in Europe. And so that colonial history is connected directly to how we experience colonialism in North America. So something that promises or even potentially promises to change what that looks like in a dramatic way, that's something Indigenous people need to know about and need to talk about. Without a doubt, consumer concerns about global warming are a key driver for the cultured meat industry. This isn't being driven by Indigenous concerns. This is being driven by primarily white settlers who want to eat healthy, but also want to eat tasty and want to eat things that aren't going to make them feel implicated in environmental degradation. But it's not the only motivator. President Biden's aim in supporting cultured meat includes increasing food security. Given the connections that scholars and activists have made between animal agriculture and disease or contagion, health is also a concern, with many viewing labs as potentially more hygienic than farms. There's also the possibility of individual control. So Dr. Mark Post speculates that cultured meat technology could become accessible to the average person. Post states, you can do this in your kitchen, you can grow your own meat. This is exciting, but at the same time, as a person who tried to grow just regular vegetables in their yard and failed dramatically, I'm not exactly keen to line up to try to grow meat at home. The possible ways that could go bad, I can't even begin to enumerate. So I'm a little hesitant about what I see as the individuation of the technology in terms of how it's being marketed and proposed to us. But as you can see here, the image of the tiger steak, this idea that you don't need to give up the possibility of having exciting, adventurous culinary experiences in order to also be a good person and support animal rights. They're trying to sell us an experience that is moral in quality as well as gastronomic. So I started some of this work not long after starting work at Dalhousie University in Halifax. So I had the opportunity to move back to my traditional territory. I was very excited to do so, and I did. And so in the Dal context, not long after starting work there, I discovered that we had a 3D printer in the library near my office. And so I went down to check it out, because to me, this was very new technology, and I was really interested to see how it functioned. And I had heard people describe cultured meat as sort of akin to doing 3D printing. And so I wanted to see something that was at least parallel. So I went, and the fellow running it showed me how it worked and showed off the technology by printing a little 3D robot for me out of layers of plastic. And so once I had a basic grasp of the process by which cultured meat was made, I began to imagine how such a project might or might not integrate with 3D printing technologies to give us something akin to the Star Trek food replicator, in which I could someday press a button and lab-grown meat would be immediately printed to my specifications or available for me in some way. And so once I had a sense of what was possible, I started to wonder how that process and how the resulting product might fit or not fit within the cultural protocols and practices related to food that I had engaged in among the Mi'kmaq and the Ulnu. And so a lot of this then starts to touch on the concept of food sovereignty. Much of my research work examines how culture supports well-being for Indigenous people and access to traditional food, to traditional hunting methods, and access to food steeped in cultural values and protocols, and really to have the right to have functioning food economies is all bound up in the concept of food sovereignty. Livia Campanisa defines food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food, produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. And so food sovereignty is looking at changing power structures that keep people from being able to have agency over their own food. A lot of the work I do is in the health field, and so food is a key social determinant of health. If you are food insecure, if you don't have enough food to eat, if you don't have enough healthy food, if you can't access the right food, or you're going to sleep hungry, you're not going to be functioning at your best. And so food sovereignty is a key piece of Indigenous health. So I started thinking about how might cultured meat relate to food sovereignty. And one of the big issues is increasing urbanization. So today, 45% of Indigenous peoples in my territory, and about half of Indigenous peoples nationally, live in an urban center. And this impacts our food choices and our food practices. Most of us don't have access to traditional food, and most of us don't know how to get traditional food. So, like a lot of other Indigenous peoples, we purchase our food at the same grocery venues as settlers do, and we're exposed to the same dietary products and choices as they are. And this is a problem, partly because we're economically oppressed. So Indigenous peoples, like many other economically oppressed groups, have difficulty being able to afford fresh food. Sometimes we live in urban areas where there isn't a source of fresh food, called a food desert. And so when you don't have access to fresh food, you end up eating food that isn't healthy, that is highly processed. And so a study, for instance, done of what Mi'kmaq diets looked like in my territory found that a lot of people were eating highly processed sources of protein, like bologna or peanut butter. And so we're not looking at a vibrant traditional food culture that is now suddenly menaced by cultured food. What we're looking at is a fairly assimilated food culture that is now being threatened by further assimilation and is constantly being threatened by increasing encroachment on the territories where traditional animals traditionally lived. And so we're really looking at how do we preserve and maintain a food culture that is already threatened. So since most of us purchase food at a grocery store, this becomes a problem of how we maintain traditional food knowledge and how do we express food values in new settings. That's a key piece of maintaining our cultural identity. But the Mi'kmaq are very adaptable. And so I went into it thinking about adaptability. But this isn't just an issue for us. This is an issue for many Indigenous peoples. Atlanta Grant is a master's student at the University of British Columbia and a member of the Huron-Wendat Nation, who does work on food sovereignty as well. And Grant connects food, territory, and cultural survival. Once the land goes, Grant says, on those ways of eating go, Indigenous and food culture goes as well. And so there's a lot at stake, no pun intended. And it was the impact on Mi'kmaq and Ulnowi food culture that first came to my mind when I considered the issue of cultured meat. What is this going to do to daily food practices? So to reflect on this and to try to come up with some solutions, I started with our stories, looking at how those stories presented animals, how they presented hunting, and how they presented the consumption of meat more generally. With that, I found that stories were an affirmation that animals were people, that is, individuals with personality and intelligence, and their own distinct relationship to the creator. And I noticed that several of the stories featured humans and other animals as related through a complex network of created beings. So there is no individual per se. Everyone is part of this interconnected network or web. And you can't just pluck someone up out of it and expect that they're going to make sense apart from that context. I also noted that many of the stories had a tendency to view animals as sacrificing themselves to feed human beings, often out of pity for our plight. If the Mi'kmaq were to create a hierarchy of all the animals, I think maybe human beings would be at the bottom because we're always portrayed as learning from the animals. And the animals are often wiser and smarter than we are. And so there's almost a reversal of what we sometimes see in settler frameworks, where humans are assumed to be superior to animals. In a Mi'kmaq framework, where we're at least on equal footing, but I suspect maybe humans are slightly lower than that. And so perhaps the other animals feel sorry for us in this context. Mi'kmaq's stories tell us that our relationship with other animals is dependent upon us demonstrating our respect for them. So one such story is called Diem's Promise. The story tells of a Mi'kmaq family close to starvation during a harsh winter who pray to the creator for food. And so the moose appears at their wigwam with a bargain. And the bargain is, if they only kill a moose when they need one, when they're absolutely in dire need of food, and if they make tobacco offerings and treat the bones as sacred, then the moose would always return to feed the people. And if they disrespected the moose, then the moose would leave and never return. And I did some exploration to see, well, what exactly are the protocols of respect related to hunting? And there are a number of them. So some of them have to do with the bones of the animal, how the bones are treated. So for instance, you're supposed to use all parts of the animal in order to acknowledge their sacrifice and not waste it. And people differ as to what that involves. But in general, it's viewed as inappropriate to take some portions of the moose and leave the rest to rot. That ideally the scenario is you would use every piece of the moose in any way it can be used. Moose have a little bit that hangs down under their chin called the dewlap. And some people report that the dewlap should be hung in a tree to indicate to other moose that the moose was harvested in a culturally appropriate way, according to the agreement. Many elders agree that you shouldn't give the bones of an animal that you've hunted to the dogs to chew on. That this is seen as disrespectful. And some Mi'kmaq stories suggest that the bones are key to reincarnation. And so there's something about the spiritual beliefs that have to do with how we should treat the body in order to keep the animals reincarnating and returning, so there's a constant supply of food. So to show respect for the moose, the Mi'kmaq use all the animal's body parts they can, and the parts that can't be used are returned to the creator via burial. And Mi'kmaq hunters must show respect for the moose by laying a circle of tobacco around the body, by saying a prayer of gratitude, sometimes initiating a pipe ceremony to release the animal's spirit. Hunters might ask for forgiveness and to let the animal know that the gift of its life is appreciated. And then moose meat is shared with community members in need, and many communities have a communal freezer for this purpose. So previously, people would have gone from community home to home, sharing with those in need. Nowadays, some of that is done online. I've seen people on Facebook, for instance, mention that they recently have a harvest of some kind of source, and that they're offering sections to community members in need if they want it. And so I see this done with lobster. I see this done with moose meat. And so it's a fairly common practice still. I also considered the moose as a case study on the issue of cultured meat because it was the animal that I found mentioned most often in relation to hunting. Due to its immensely large size, so an adult moose is 1.5 to 2 meters high at the shoulder. The moose is considered the chief of all land animals and is a counterpart to the whale, who is king of the ocean. And traditionally, the killing of a moose was a significant event. Some sources identify it as serving as a young man's entry into adulthood by signaling to others that he has the skills to support a family and the patience and the maturity to participate in political councils. So being able to actually obtain a moose yourself indicates that you have patience and maturity, which are valued qualities. For hunting to be culturally rooted, it has to occur in a context that's informed by the life cycle of the moose as a species. So in many of the hunting protocols, even the way they're adopted today, they have to take place in a context where people know the animal. They know the species and how it behaves, and they know its needs at different points of the year. And they understand how the animals are going to be affected by their own practices. And so moose hunting is permitted in the late summer and fall, but not in the late winter, spring, or early summer. And this is to give the population time to rest and reproduce. And this expresses the value of non-interference, which instructs us not to interfere in the lives and choices of others, And in the case of animals, means not interfering with their habits or their habitats. And this might even be taken further into a responsibility to engage in environmental stewardship or activism to protect animal habitats. And of course, never killing them unless necessary. So the Mi'kmaq used what we call subsistence hunting, which is you don't kill a whole bunch of animals and then store them for for future use. You only take those animals you absolutely need in the moment. And so people have sometimes described this as like the world is your larder approach. But it's really about not interfering with the lives of other animals unless you absolutely need it to survive. To understand what might be lost in a shift to cultured meat, I learned about the history of the moose in our territory. So by the late 1800s, most of the moose on the mainland had been hunted within a breath of extinction. And this suggested to me that perhaps we had, in fact, broken our agreement with the moose. That the moose had said if we failed to treat them with respect, that they would go away and never come back in the story. And it seemed as if that had indeed been the case. Although you can see the hunting protocols, some of them outlined here, the fact that there were almost no mainland moose on mainland Nova Scotia was a significant issue. And so the Mi'kmaq being able to have a hunting relationship with moose was threatened because you can't hunt an extinct species, and it's directly against our values to put a species into its own extinction. Because the relationship is what's important, not just the food. So while the right of the Mi'kmaq to hunt animals, such as the moose, is protected in treaties signed with the Crown, those guidelines forbid hunting on mainland Nova Scotia due to the endangered species of the moose. By the late 1800s, as I said, most of the mainland moose were hunted to almost extinction. So in the 1940s, moose from the province of Alberta were transported by train to Unama'ki, to Cape Breton Island. And so Mi'kmaq guidelines outline appropriate ways to interact with the moose. The mainland moose population today is estimated at about 1,000, whereas the moose population in Cape Breton is now 5 times that. As a result, moose hunting has been permitted in Unama'ki since the late 1980s. The Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources supports a moose working group, and that group includes the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative and strives to increase public awareness of Mi'kmaq cultural values related to moose and to moose hunting. One of those values is Nadukalimp, which some refer to as skills required for hunting and fishing. Some see it as skills required to become a protector of other species. But historical ecologist Russell Barsh suggests Nadukalimp is related to the Mi'kmaq prefix Nutkwa, indicating insufficiency. And really the term refers to the idea of avoiding not having enough, rather than accumulating abundance, for instance. In a Mi'kmaq philosophical framework, it's not abundance for which we strive, it's only sufficiency. So our subsistence hunting traditions, framed by ethnocentric settlers sometimes as a slacking industry or a commercial vision, is actually a conscious choice rooted in Mi'kmaq Olney values. So this work led me to a number of questions. If we engage or embrace with culturally new ideas like cultured meat, what will happen to ceremony? The Mi'kmaq conduct ceremony when we kill a moose, but we don't usually do it if we order food from a takeaway or a grocery store. Will cultured meat, I wondered, separate us further from ceremony? So I worried about that. I wondered too about whether our view of animals as persons would suffer. If we normalize the culturing process, might this cause meat to be seen as a thing? Would it despiritualize meat to be a despirited object rather than the sacrificial gift of a brother and a friend that exists within a web of interdependent life? I wondered if the concept of sacrifice is removed from the equation, and if moose meat is grown and harvested, would our relationship with food, and with the moose, for instance, still be grounded in respect and gratitude? So I worried about how those elements that I saw as really working to connect people and their food to culture how that might be affected and changed if we introduced cultured meat. I wondered further, would cultured meat increase our assimilation to settler values and habits? Would it remove the living animal from meat production and further distance us from traditional intimacy with animals, which is already at risk with so many of us living in urban centers? I wondered if cultural meat would support individualism. So the traditional moose harvest is about more than just meat, it's about community. When harvesting a moose, there's a value in the moose itself, and then there's a value in our relationship with the moose as a species, and with the local ecosystems that both human beings and the moose inhabit. So even now, when a moose is killed, the meat is shared with members of human and animal communities who need food support. However, if cultured meat is bought at a store, or if I generate it in my own kitchen, don't I risk losing the experience of being in community and the communal activities that express and reinforce our identity as a people? In vitro meat promises a future where I don't actually need to interact with other Mi'kmaq people to have moose meat, and I don't even need to interact with the moose itself. If meat is available at the press of a button, what's that going to do to our identity as a people? Is it going to slowly chip away at all the ways that currently engage us? And food is a big one. I also considered how the values expressed in our relationship with the moose, such as Ndukalimk, brotherhood, and respect, could be transferred to a context in which the moose is cultured in a lab or kitchen rather than hunted. One possibility I considered is that our relationship with the moose could be incorporated into the epigenetic code of the moose and into ours as well. And this is where my work got really difficult because I am not a geneticist. And so I found trying to grasp the concept of epigenetics to be extremely challenging. I think one of the stories that helped me was about an experiment done with mice. And so they had taken mice and conditioned them to be afraid of the smell of cherries. And then they reproduced those mice and took the mice babies away from the mice parents and fostered them with mice who hadn't been part of the experiment to begin with. I guess to eliminate the cultural training mice might give one another. And then they examined the mice babies. And sure enough, not only were the mice babies who had been raised by the foster parent mice also afraid of the cherry smell, as their birth parents had been conditioned to be, but they had more areas of their nose and their brain that were designed, say, to recognize the cherry smell. Those areas were enlarged. And so even within one generation, the physical experiences, the social experiences of an ancestor were shaping the experiences of their descendants. And so I've also encountered this in Indigenous health, where, for instance, people whose parents or grandparents attended residential school, those attendees, those survivors of residential school, show a number of negative health outcomes, particularly related to stress and malnutrition, but to other factors as well. But then their children and grandchildren also demonstrate impacts that result from that experience at the genetic level. And so having some experience of this in Indigenous health, I started to think about what might it mean for both the genetics of the moose and the genetics of the Mi'kmaq. And so what I learned from my cursory exploration of epigenetics is that epigenetics examines the ways that we inherit things genetically in terms of what our genes contain, whether particular elements of that genetic code are turned on or turned off in any given moment. And so I wondered whether the epigenetic relationship between the moose and the Mi'kmaq might actually be captured in the cultured meat created from the cells of a moose. So I looked into what was known about moose experience. And I found a study in Sweden that measured cortisol levels in 78 moose that had been shot by rifle. Cortisol is a chemical that gets released by the adrenal gland during times of stress. And cortisol levels are significantly higher for moose who've been pursued for more than 10 minutes compared with those who were pursued for under 10 minutes, suggesting that the moose found pursuit stressful. There were no significant differences in cortisol levels between moose who were pursued for less than 10 minutes and those who were killed unaware. So the cortisol takes a little while to get going, perhaps. And that stress relates to pursuit specifically, and not to say death, is supported by the high levels of cortisol found in moose who were pursued but tranquilized instead of killed. And so we could argue that stressful relations between moose and hunters could influence the epigenetic code of subsequent moose and subsequent hunters for generations. Zoologist Dr. Samuel K. Vassar did a chemical analysis of animal scat, that's poo, in the oil sands area of Alberta. And Vassar found that moose appear to have a lower physiological stress response to human activity than animals such as caribou do, suggesting that they've gotten used to humans. They've acquired a familiarity with them, and that could be passed on to future generations as well. So given this work, it seemed likely to me that the genetic code of the moose in our traditional territories might contain elements that have been shaped by their interactions with us, and our code might similarly contain elements shaped by their relationship with us. I also considered how use of cultured meat could be indigenized. So if it were going to occur anyway, what could the Mi'kmaq do to make it more Mi'kmaq friendly? Could it be decolonized and made to flesh better in, to mesh with our own cultural values? And so one possibility that occurred to me was to draw on protocols related to gathering plants and medicines. So when harvesting, for example, we must approach plants with respect. We ask their permission to gather them, and we avoid overharvesting. James Youngblood Henderson notes that a person gathering roots, leaves, or bark for medicinal purposes pleases the life force of each plant by placing a small offering of tobacco at its base. And these protocols could be transferred, I thought, effectively treating cultured meat as a type of plant. New protocols would have to compete with habits that instrumentalize food, of course. But in philosophical terms, the gathering of plants and medicines, I thought, could offer a starting point for a protocol around cultured meat that was still rooted in Mi'kmaq values. A second model that occurred to me came from the story of Ngumi and fire. In that story, Glooskap is friends with the animals, particularly the American pine marten that I mentioned earlier. These images come from an amazing animated version of the story narrated by Ida Denny and directed by Tasha Rain Ramsey. So if you're not familiar with the story of Ngumi and fire, I encourage you to check it out. So essentially, Glooskap has a grandmother and he has a friend, Abistanoich, the American pine marten. And Glooskap is told that his grandmother needs meat in order to survive. She can't live on plants and berries alone. And so he asks the American pine marten, Abistanoich, to sacrifice himself so Glooskap's grandmother can live. And Abistanoich agrees, permitting Glooskap's grandmother to snap his neck. However, once Abistanoich is dead, Glooskap regrets it. You can see him here in the lower right, regretting it. And his grandmother prays to the creator. And in this version, in the animated version of the story, Glooskap does the praying to the creator, and Abistanoich comes back to life. But his previous body also remains there, able to be consumed. So Abistanoich is both present as meat that can be eaten and also present as a friend that returns to the river. Since in vitro meat, cultured meat technology, can use cells from a living animal, then the moose, or any animal, enters a situation akin to marten, the Abistanoich, it seems to me. Available to eat, yet also alive as a being that is related to us in a web of kinship and interdependence. Thinking back to the story in which the moose makes the bargain with the starving Mi'kmaq, I could imagine a situation in which we could renegotiate that agreement. So the moose sacrifices cells rather than lives. And the consumption of in vitro meat could be framed as an expression of Nadukalimp, avoiding not having enough, but also as an expression of non-interference by reducing our impact on animal life, which the process promises potentially to do. I'm not alone in thinking about the place of cultured meat. Atlanta Grant considers what impact cultured salmon might have on indigenous nations of the West Coast, for example, for whom the fish plays a significant cultural role. Grant worries that sushi-grade salmon produced in a lab, for example, might further separate indigenous peoples of the West from their sacred animals and further undermine indigenous food security and sovereignty in the name of addressing climate change, which indigenous people did not actually cause. Cree scholar Tabitha Robin Martins, an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, views cultured meat as violence. Moose, salmon, deer are kin, not just food, Robbins explains. For indigenous peoples, she suggests, the healthiest food we can eat is food that contains the most relationships. Because moose is in contact with the sun, wind, stars, soil, plants, etc., it is full of good relationships. Martin suggests cellular food is devoid of good relationships. I don't have a solution, but I think that's a conversation that's starting to happen, and I think it's one that's worth participating in. I'll end here and say Walaliak, which is thank all of you, and I look forward to your questions or comments. Back to you, Jen.
Margaret, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. You know, the idea of lab meat certainly raises questions for all of us. And so to hear an Indigenous perspective on it is of course, very, very interesting. We'll go to a couple questions. And the first one is, I wonder if you could say a little bit about the connection between veganism and your Indigenous culture.
Sure. Well, I guess technically there isn't one. So I started doing this work in about 2008. In 2007, my partner and I got cats, as one does. And being around animals constantly in a way that I hadn't since I was quite young reinforced for me that there's a someone in there, and that the people, the animals with which we were interacting on a daily basis had personalities. They weren't just interchangeable with any other cat or animal. And so that started making me connect a number of points related to how I engage with food that had always sort of been bothering me. And eventually it culminated in me going vegan for a week around my birthday in 2008. And then it was September and I noticed, you know, I'm still kind of doing this food thing. And every so often people would mention it and I'd say, yeah, you know, I'm still doing it. And at first I pretended it was about losing weight. And maybe it was back then, but it very quickly became about a lot more than that. It really became about what is my relationship with animals going to be, and how am I going to justify the values that I hold when I look at the practices that I'm engaging in on a daily basis. And so one of these was around food and the role of animal food. I remember the Christmas before, I had tried to make a fish chowder. So fish chowder is a traditional food in the Maritimes. And I had a recipe from my partner's mom. And so I would try to reproduce this. And one year we hadn't bought the fish in time. I just got really busy. And so I had to go to Chinatown to get the fish, because on Christmas Eve, it was the only place that was open. And so I went in, and if you've never purchased a full fish in its natural state, this was new to me as well. Even growing up in the Maritimes, I had been used to food that came from a grocery store, not to fresh fish. And so I had this fish with a head and eyes and a tail, and I tried to fillet it. I was unskilled and had poor tools for the job, and was suddenly hit with the realization, this isn't meant to come apart. I had thought I could just kind of somehow open the fish and remove the fillets. And that didn't seem to be how the fish was structured at all. So it made me realize that the fish wasn't designed for chowder, that this was something I had been doing with fish, but this was not in any way innate to the structure of the fish body. And so I started reading some vegan works. I started reading the work of Carol Adams, for instance. And it made me realize that a lot of the things that had bothered me about eating meat, I had just been shifting off to the side and not dealing with. So if I got squicked out by finding veins in my chicken, I would shift to a different meat for a while, and then come back to chicken later. But eventually I realized that I didn't like the way that I was feeling hypocritical about it. So I was in a stuck spot because the Mi'kmaq come from a culture where animal products make up like 90% of our traditional diet. We were fishers, we were hunters. And so what do I do when my sources of protein are no longer animal-based? How do I engage with my Mi'kmaq culture and my Mi'kmaq values if I'm eating this new vegan diet? And increasingly, it wasn't just about eating. It was also about, what do I purchase? What do I wear? And so for me, veganism became the question of, is this something that can connect me more closely with my Indigenous values? Or is this something that's going to separate me and make me feel more assimilated? And I didn't really want things that made me feel more assimilated. I already lived in an enormous urban center, far from my traditional territory. So I was looking to reconnect. And so veganism became a way that I could reconnect with those values, even if our practices were very different still.
Thank you. And something that jumped out at me when you were speaking was that when you talked about the idea of hunting for sustenance and only killing an animal if it's necessary, that sounds, that sounds a lot like the ethic of a lot of vegans who say, it's unnecessary to kill animals in the context in which I am living, and therefore, I don't see a reason to do it, or I don't see a justification for it. And so, you also mentioned that so many Indigenous people are living in urban centers now. And so do you see the lab meat as potentially a way to bridge that gap? Whereas, an Indigenous person like yourself who goes vegan is going to have something very, very different from their traditional diet. Do you see the potential of lab meat as potentially filling that gap?
I think it has the potential to fill a gap depending on how it's engaged with. So I think the situation you describe about realizing that I didn't need to ask animals to sacrifice themselves for me was exactly the situation I found myself in, where I had lots of access to fresh food and access to healthy food. A lot of it was very inexpensive where I was living, and I didn't need to ask an animal to die for me. And so going by the story of Nagumi and fire, I was not in Nagumi's position. I was in Glooskap's position, because the story, some of the versions of the story suggest that before Nagumi came along, maybe Glooskap wasn't eating meat, because they presented as sort of like this novel idea that Nagumi can't survive without meat. Glooskap hadn't asked Martin to die before, it doesn't seem. Although some stories present Glooskap as a very skilled hunter, so sort of friend to animals, but also a hunter. Different stories present him in different ways. But I felt like I didn't need to do that. And so whether there might be Indigenous people who see the importance of a particular animal and its body as ceremonially or culturally important, perhaps cultured meat could serve that need. I think there are a lot of questions, though, that still need to be answered before we would feel completely comfortable full steam ahead with cultured meat as the solution. One of the biggest problems is it's a technology that's still in the hands of settlers. And we don't have a great track record with that situation when it comes to supporting Indigenous sovereignty, particularly food sovereignty. If Indigenous people aren't involved in the production, if they're not involved in the decision-making, then it might not be the solution we think it could be.
Right. And I know, thinking even about non-Indigenous people, a lot of people are kind of put off by the idea of lab meat as unnatural or strange because it requires so much technology. And do you think Indigenous people are going to have that same kind of aversion to it because it seems perhaps even further away from the traditional way of obtaining food?
I think that could be an issue. I think many of us are under the illusion that our food systems are already more natural than they really are. In fact, we're already regularly consuming genetically modified foods. We're already regularly consuming foods that someone has trademarked, not just a recipe for, but trademarked the actual ingredients of the plant, or perhaps in the future, the animal life that was involved in the food. And so I think we sometimes idealize our food as if it's just this natural process that somehow separates out lab-grown meat, when I feel like it's much more of a spectrum. And depending on what we're eating, we might fall very far into the modified end of that spectrum already.
Now, this is a bit of a large topic, so I don't want to overwhelm you, but I wonder, you did mention near the beginning of your talk, the connection between meat and colonialism. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that to give us some context.
Sure. I come from both sides of this history. My mother's ancestors came to Mi'kma'ki via Newfoundland, which at the time wasn't necessarily part of Mi'kma'ki, depending on who you ask. And they are from Scotland, Ireland, and England. And so essentially Europe was having a food problem. They had too many people and they couldn't feed them all. They had deforested many of their country areas. They couldn't produce food in the quantities and move it quickly enough into urban areas. They were facing really urban populations that were eating rotten food and couldn't sustain themselves. The food movement systems they had to get food from point A to point B, food arrived spoiled. We didn't have refrigeration back in the day, so food could only last as long as it could get to the next consumer, and ideally before it was spoiled. And so if you've ever watched it's a documentary, I think, talks about how we came to have the food companies that we do today. You can see that this history of food, it's really about spoilage and preventing food spoilage. And so a lot of the technologies that we have, including refrigeration, came to solve this problem. But the first way we tried to solve it was by sending lots of people away out of Europe to the New World, as they called it. And so having those people arrive, in many cases hungry and desperate, they didn't know the environments into which they were going. Unless they connected with the indigenous peoples of that area, they might not know what they could eat. They brought a lot of their food with them and attempted to recreate those food systems in their new spaces. And so eventually, particularly around the late 1800s, this started to involve moving indigenous people off their land, off their territories, which was something in many cases they had already agreed with the indigenous populations that had helped them when they arrived not to do. And so the claiming of indigenous territory in order to replicate settler food technologies of the time period, that really became the building block of colonialism. So you're moving off indigenous people, you're moving off indigenous animals, you're, as they called it, clearing the land, and then you're installing replacement animals, settler farm animals. And so there you get this sort of split between the good cow and the evil wolf. The wolf is evil because it might eat your cow and is an indigenous predator. The cow is good because you plan on eating it and you're the predator. And so really the claiming of indigenous territory, the land theft we see through colonialism, is built on installing this new food system to feed the settler population as it increases and expands. And so we then see intentional destruction of indigenous food economies like the buffalo, intentionally destroyed in order to starve nations in the West into agreeing to treaties that were not to their benefit. And so they were promised food they did not receive. Sometimes the food they received through these promises were Well, it created some food problems today that we are still dealing with. And so things like fry bread, people frame them as indigenous foods, but actually they are foods that indigenous people created to work with the settler staples they were being forced to use in place of their traditional foods. And so the history of colonialism in North America, anyway, is really about food and about settlers claiming areas in order to control the food economies in the New World.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question, and I'm glad you mentioned Carol Adams a moment ago, because you're going to like this question. And we were fortunate to have Carol speak in our virtual speaker series recently as well, so that was fantastic. So the question is, I'm just going to read this out. Dr. Robinson, further to your point about the possibility of in vitro meat erasing the personhood of animals, could you perhaps comment on how the sexual politics of meat, Carol Adams, might relate to the notion of bodily autonomy of the moose and animals in general? I hear you that in vitro meat is happening anyway, but the idea of animal flesh being made in a lab does seem to transcend even further the patriarchal idea of animals as objects deserving of control and domination.
Yes. I think it's, Adams would find it very interesting, I think, that the technology that spurs the growth of the meat proteins involves the reproductive cycle of the animals, particularly the female animals, and that it's really a furthering of animal husbandry in engaging in technologies that usurp the reproductive systems and really erase the reproductive relationships that animals have with their offspring. And so there's a sexist element to it, because people are much more comfortable controlling the reproduction of female bodies, whether they're human or other animals, than they are controlling the bodies of males. And so I think you want to say like the thin edge of the wedge, as it were, always slips in so much more easily when it's got a sexist coding, that it's easier to sell something that is going to primarily affect females of some sort, whether human or other animal, than it is to sell anything else. And so I think Adam's descriptions about sort of how meat is presented as sexy, as something that you can conquer and possess. I remember a new barbecue place went up on the street on Spadina Avenue, where I would come down on the streetcar. And every time I went by it, there was like this sexy pig advertising the barbecue, sort of leaning back, almost as if inviting the audience to engage with them in some sort of sexual way. And it just continually made me remember the sexual politics of meat. And so I think here we're seeing something similar, where indigenous women are used to being fetishized and exotified. Well, with the arrival of new exotic game meats that maybe before someone might have felt hesitant about engaging in, they're exotifying the product. They're making it seem like a new experience that the world savvy connoisseur can now consume safely and without regret. And so I worry about how that kind of overlaps with the ongoing objectification and exotification and fetishization of Indigenous women. And so I think there are a lot of places where you can connect those concerns. And I don't think they're necessarily extremist. I think they're just how people have expressed their sexism in food for many, many, many years.
Margaret, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. I know personally I learned a lot. I'm sure our other viewers did as well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jen. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.